Hello all, I'm Scorp SCS, but that's not important right now because in this episode of Cogs, Gears and Optic Sensors, we are taking a look back at a forgotten little story from January 1986 by UK penciler Barry Kitson and franchise scribe extraordinaire Simon Furman. Now, when people talk about Furman's greatest Marvel UK stories, names like Target 2006 and the Legacy of Unicron usually dominate the conversation. On the surface, this is simply a story of Swoop's return after disappearing months earlier. But look a little closer and you'll find something much more interesting. It's a story about obsession, about leadership, and about a writer beginning to realise just how ambitious Transformers comics could become. This, folks, is the Icarus Theory. Simon Furman was still relatively early in his run as lead writer, but you can already see his confidence growing. Rather than producing isolated adventures, he was beginning to weave stories together into a much larger narrative. In fact, the Icarus Theory doesn't really begin on page 1. Its roots stretch back through Crisis of Command, and even both the Wrath of Guardian and Wrath of Grimlock storylines before that. Furman doesn't ignore his earlier tales. Swoop's return only has the impact it does because Marvel UK remembers its own continuity. Swoop isn't simply missing, he's presumed destroyed in the Guardian explosion. In many comics, the character simply reappeared without explanation, or in some cases, appeared without explanation. Furman rewards the readers for paying attention, and just as importantly, it sets the stage for the Dynamo Hunt storyline that follows. It's one of the first times Marvel UK genuinely feels like it's telling one continuous story rather than a collection of weekly adventures. Now, that may seem commonplace to us here in the future, but in 1986 it was quite revolutionary, especially for a licensed kids comic. And one thing I've often wondered about is why Furman created Professor Morris at all. Dr. Arkeville already existed in Transformers lore, and if all you needed was a scientist capable of controlling Transformers, he'd have been the obvious choice. But Morris is a very different character. Arkeville was always a straightforward villain, Morris isn't. He's proud, frustrated, and a man whose obsession slowly pushes him over the edge. But in hindsight, I think creating a new character gave Furman the freedom to tell a much more tragic story. Working for Roxxon Oil, he's absolutely convinced he's discovered the truth behind the giant robots appearing across America. Whilst everyone else sees alien invaders, Morris believes they're sophisticated machines secretly controlled by industrialist GB BlackRock. But unfortunately for him, the Rocks on board thinks he's completely lost it. Which, to be fair, is probably the reaction you'd get if you walked into your next team meeting and announced your competitor was secretly controlling giant shape-shifting robots. His presentation to them is dismissed, his funding rejected, and Morris leaves humiliated.
Boy, that escalated quickly. That really got out of hand fast.
Now, other writers might have turned him into a stereotypical mad scientist. Furman doesn't. Instead, Morris feels painfully human. He's intelligent, he's proud, and perhaps most importantly, he's desperate to prove everyone else wrong. That obsession is perfectly summed up in one tiny detail when we see him fishing in Lake Dina. Except there aren't any fish, and it's such a throwaway moment it's really easy to miss, but it tells you everything about Morris. If he believes there's something to be found, he'll keep searching until he finds it. And he does, because what he drags out of the lake isn't a fish at all, it's Swoop. He catches a Dinobot, and given that he single-handedly reels him in from the bottom of the lake, Morris must work out. And here's something that's easy to forget if you're watching this in 2026. Swoop was actually quite an unusual choice for the spotlight. His toy wasn't released at UK or European retail, with the sole exception of Italy. So, for most UK readers, the comic was their main introduction to the character, while the limited release the cartoons saw here. That makes Furman's decision making all the more interesting. Rather than building around the popular Grimlock, he gives centre stage to probably the least familiar Dinobot, which when you think about it is a bit of a gamble. Furman basically said, I'm going to centre a story around this flying Dinobot that a lot of British kids couldn't even buy in the shops. But back to Morris. Rather than simply repairing the injured Dinobot, Morris uses a machine of his own invention to control him remotely, and for the first time in his life, Morris has genuine power. Through Swoop, he experiences both flight and feels invincible. It's here that the story earns its title, as most people assume the Icarus Theory is simply a reference to Morris flying through Swoop. But in Greek mythology, Icarus doesn't fall because he can fly. He falls because he believes he's above the rules. And that's Morris. His brilliance convinces him he's right. His pride convinces him everybody else is wrong. And every compromise afterwards becomes just a little easier than the last. One of the darkest story moments arrives almost by accident as a Roxxon security guard discovers Morris working out of hours and attempts to blackmail him. The panicked Morris lashes out, but still connected to his neural relay link, Swoop responds and the guard is killed. And the reason this is so dark is because Morris never intended it to happen. For a brief moment, he even considers giving himself up. But instead, he doubles down to the point of no return, because confessing would mean admitting everyone else was right all along. But back at the Ark, the Autobots have problems of their own when they are suddenly attacked by the mind-controlled, effectively a drone Swoop. Kitson does a wonderful job, as his Swoop carries visible scars from the explosion that supposedly destroyed him months earlier, subtly reminding us, the reader, that this isn't simply a familiar carrier returning, but he's damaged in more ways than one. And one thing I've always liked is how Optimus Prime approaches the situation. As all the other Autobots try to stop Swoop by force, Prime tries something different, by simply ordering him to transform. And following on from Crisis in Command, it reveals everything about Optimus as a leader. He doesn't see an enemy. He sees a fellow Autobot who's trapped. And because Prime understands his comrade, he succeeds where brute force fails. It's a fantastic character moment, and one that quietly establishes the Optimus Prime Furman would spend years developing. The issue also slips in a wonderful little piece of UK originated lore. Prime reveals that Swoop was once known as Dive Bomb, serving in Cybertron's elite flying corps. Now, at the time, it was simply an intriguing bit of backstory. But ironically, when Hasbro later introduced the Predacon dive bomb in the 1986 toy line, Marvel UK had to explain why two Transformers shared the same name, leading to the brilliant little story, What's in a Name, from the 1987 UK annual, and was further explored in Grudge Match, way ahead in issue 135 and 136 of the UK title. It does make me wonder if Furman had seen the original cartoon production Bible, which had originally named Swoop as Dive Bomb and was corrected late enough that it was done by hand. But just when everything seems to have been resolved, Morris destroys the control device, and as justice is about to take its course, Swoop attacks again. But this time, nobody is controlling him, and just to compound things for our Autobots, Ratchet makes a diagnosis that is both tragic and terrifying, the implications of which will lead into the next UK storyline, as it seems that after the millions of years trapped beneath the tar pits, Swoop's mind has begun to break down. And if that's happened to Swoop, then what about the other Dinobots? And suddenly what looked like a self-contained adventure becomes something much larger. See, looking back today, the Icarus Theory most definitely isn't Simon Furman's biggest story. It isn't his most spectacular, but I think it might be one of his most important. It gives us one of Marvel UK's most believable human antagonists. It develops Optimus Prime through compassion rather than combat, and it transforms Swoop from simply the flying Dinobot into a genuine character. And most importantly, it shows Simon Furman beginning to trust his readers to follow a much bigger narrative. And a little interesting piece of trivia for you, it's also a UK story with no Decepticons in it.
There's no one here. I must have static in my rectifiers.
Now, without stories like this, I honestly don't think Target 2006, Time Wars, or even the legacy of Unicron would have had quite the same impact. So the next time you read the Icarus Theory, don't just watch Swoop. Remember that man patiently fishing in a lake with no fish? It turns out that little scene told us exactly who Professor Morris is from the very beginning. Because beneath all the robot action is a very human tragedy about pride, obsession, and the danger of believing you're always the smartest person in the room. And that's why, 40 years later, I still think this forgotten little two-parter, which admittedly makes one traditionally sized US issue, deserves another look. And for many fans, it remained one of those stories that was easier to remember than it was to actually revisit until Titan Books finally brought it back into print nearly 20 years later in 2004 as part of the Dinobot Hunt collection. And that, folks, is the Icarus Theory. So, where did you encounter Swoop first? In the comics here or in the cartoon? Let me know in the comments. But as always, thanks for watching along. And if you like this video, then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you didn't like it, then leave one anyway. If you want to come and say hi on social media, then you can find me here. But whatever you do, folks, stay safe.